This next section begins with Richard coming home, and he's got his flowers. He's going to tell Clarissa that he loves her, and while he's heading into the house, she is sitting in the drawing room. It says that the sound of Big Ben flooded the drawing room, so the clock is striking again. We don't find out till down here that it's 3 o'clock, but I'm just making a note for you here. And at the moment, Clarissa is fretting because someone that she doesn't like, Ellie Henderson, wants to come to her party. And so Mrs. Marsham, who was another friend of Clarissa's, had written to Clarissa and said that, Ellie Henderson really would like to be invited. She so much wants to come. And just look at how Clarissa responds to this idea. Why should she invite all the dull women in London to her parties? Why should Mrs. Marsham interfere? And then there was Elizabeth, closeted all this time with Doris Kilman. So she's getting cranky. She doesn't want to invite this woman who she thinks is dull. She's annoyed that her friend asked her to invite this woman. At the same time, she's also annoyed that her daughter is with this woman, Doris Kilman. So Doris Kilman was mentioned earlier in the book, as she's this sort of unkempt looking lady who's sort of a religious, I don't know, she's praying with her. She's trying to somehow influence Elizabeth philosophically and religiously. And so she's like, prayer at this hour with that woman just makes her angry. And then she hears the Big Ben striking. It's 3 o'clock already. And then she hears the door, and in comes Richard. And so when she sees Richard, thankfully, her mood is lifted. What a surprise. In he comes holding flowers. So she thinks, oh gosh, I need to be more thoughtful and nicer to my husband. He's so wonderful. And she's thinking, he's just been to Lady Bruton's, whose lunch parties were supposed to be so amusing, and she hadn't been invited, but here he is holding out flowers, red and white roses. But he could not bring himself to say he loved her, not in so many words. Now, this is not Clarissa saying this. Clarissa doesn't know his goal was to say he loved her. This is just Virginia Woolf telling us he didn't actually say he loved her. We could probably have guessed that this would be the case. If you think about the previous section we just read, he must have said to himself over and over, he's going to tell her he loves her. He's going to tell her he loves her, which seems like he's trying to psych himself up to do it. He does admit in the previous section that he's shy. And so he ends up not being able to say he loves her, but he does give her the flowers, and he does believe that she understood. She understood without his speaking, his Clarissa. She put them in the vases on the mantelpiece. How lovely they look, she said. And was it amusing, she asked? Had Lady Bruton asked after her? And Peter Walsh was back. And so what happens on this next page is just like a solid married couple. They catch each other up on their day. So, Richard tells her about what it was they were doing, that they were helping her write a letter, that Peter Walsh was back. And yes, Clarissa knows Peter Walsh was back. And Richard says Hugh was at lunch, and he thinks that Hugh is such an ass. And he tells her how annoyed he was by Hugh because he was going shopping all the time. And so all the things that he was ruminating about, he's able to share with Clarissa. And you can tell here, I think, that they are of the same mind. Clarissa says, how annoyed she is that Mrs. Kilman is there and that Elizabeth is up there, apparently they're praying or whatever. And, he doesn't like it either. Richard does not like this idea of this woman coming and praying with their daughter. And they make fun of what she wears. A Macintosh is a rubbery sort of plasticky raincoat with an umbrella. He had not said, I love you, but he held her hand. Happiness is this, he thought. And this will get repeated. Happiness is this. And then she complains, why should I ask all the dull women to my parties? And if Mrs. Marsham gave a party, did she invite her guests? How does Mrs. Marsham have the nerve to, suggest who Clarissa should invite? Clarissa would never do that to anybody else. So the two of them commiserate about the people in their society and the things that they did that afternoon. But Richard had no notion of the look of a room. However, what was he going to say? If she worried about these parties, he would not let her give them. Did she wish that she had married Peter? But he must go. Okay, so I kind of jumped this page here a little bit. But as she's talking about the parties, he's thinking to himself, like, what is the big deal? It's just a party, which is a fair thought. He's looking around the room. He doesn't understand what Clarissa's saying about the room. Like, he doesn't understand, like, what it means to decorate the room or how to arrange the chairs in the room, all these things that are happening to prepare for the party. He has no opinion about that. And he's like, what am I going to tell her? She can't have the party. But on some way, he's thinking, like, I don't want her to get so stressed about it. It shouldn't be such a big deal whether or not this lady Ellie comes or not. So he also, on the back of his mind, is like, nervous about Peter. He's like, he kind of wants to ask her, do you wish you'd married Peter? But he doesn't say that either. So there's like an undercurrent of attitude here that he doesn't want his wife to see. So he has to get back to work. He stands up and he says he needs to leave. He has a committee meeting, and even he says, yeah, it's this committee meeting. It's for the Armenians or maybe the Albanians. So he doesn't even know, and he kind of like lumps them together, which is racist. And there is a dignity in people, a solitude, even between husband and wife, a gulf, and that one must respect, thought Clarissa. So this is important. I put a star here for that reason. She's realizing he's going off to work, and she doesn't really understand much about it, and she doesn't really care. And there are some things that they don't know about each other, and that's okay. That's what she's saying here. They have their own inner world, and that they should respect that in each other. She watches him open the door, for one would not part with it oneself. She doesn't want to have to tell him everything that's on her mind, or take it against his will from one's husband without losing one's independence, one's self-respect, something that's priceless. She's talking about autonomy. She's talking about the fact, and this is really Virginia Woolf saying this through Clarissa's thoughts, that people are entitled to their independence even if they're married. They don't have to share everything. He comes back before he leaves, Richard does, with a pillow and a quilt. He says, an hour's complete rest after luncheon, and then he left. So this would have been something the doctor would have told her after she had her heart condition. And she thinks to himself, oh, how like him. He'll always go on saying an hour's complete rest after lunch because the doctor had ordered it once. It was like him to take what doctors said literally, part of his adorable divine simplicity, which no one had to the same extent, which made him go and do the thing while she and Peter fritter their time away bickering. So like he does the right thing. She's comparing him to Peter, and she's realizing that Richard, like, he does the right thing. He might be simple, but he's good-hearted and he means well. He was already halfway to the House of Commons, to his Armenians, his Albanians, having settled her on the sofa looking at his roses. And people would say, Clarissa is spoiled. She cared much more for her roses than for the Armenians. Hunted out of existence, maimed, frozen, the victims of cruelty and injustice. She had heard Richard say so over and over. No, she could feel nothing for the Albanians, or was it the Armenians? I just put a question mark, exclamation point there, because in our enlightened world today, I hope we don't think that way. This is privilege. She has the privilege not to think about other people who might be suffering in the world because of her class, and she likes it that way. And of course, that is not like entirely gone from society. There are people like that. I'm sure that you know some too. Richard does not see what's wrong with asking Ellie Henderson to the party. She would do it, of course, and as he wished it. Since he had brought the pillows, she could lie down. But why did she suddenly feel, for no reason that she could discover, why was she so unhappy? So she's acknowledging that, like, her husband sees no big deal in inviting Ellie Henderson, and she will do it because it's the right thing to do. Remember, Richard does the right thing, and so she knows he wouldn't want her to say no. And all of a sudden, she's seized by this unhappiness. And here's a great simile. As a person who has dropped some grain of pearl or diamond into the grass and parts the tall blades very carefully this way and that, and searches here and there vainly, and at last spies it there at the roots, so she went through one thing and another. So she's thinking about all these little issues in her life in the same way that somebody might be searching for a precious stone amongst the many, many blades of grass. It was not Sally Seton saying that Richard would never be in the cabinet because he had a second-class brain. So this is something from the past. One of her friends, Sally, remember Sally? The one who she had lesbian leanings towards. Sally made some comment that he would never make it in politics because he's second class. No, she did not mind that, nor was it really that Elizabeth is with Doris Kilman. Those were facts. Like, those are things that happened. It was a feeling, some unpleasant feeling earlier in the day, something Peter had said. So she's still kind of bothered by Peter, combined with some depression of her own in her bedroom, taking off her hat, and what Richard had said had added to it. And what had he said? Like, what exactly? There were his roses, her parties. That was what he said, her parties. Both of them criticized her unfairly. So Peter kind of mocked her about the parties. Richard also was like, what's the big deal? It's just a party. Maybe you shouldn't get so upset about a party. That's what's got her so sad. So this could be a quiz question. Why does she feel depressed? Why is she suddenly unhappy? Because they were mocking, these two men in her life were sort of mocking her, desire to have this perfect party. And then she sort of reasons for herself. Well, how is she going to defend herself? Now that she knew what it was, she felt happy. Now she knows what it is that's bothering her. They thought, or Peter at any rate thought, that she enjoyed imposing herself, liked to have famous people about her, great names, was simply a snob, in short. Well, Peter might think so. Richard merely thought it foolish of her to like excitement when she knew it was bad for her heart. So these are the two reasons. Peter thinks she just likes to be popular. She wants people around her sort of like honoring her. And Richard thinks it's just too much excitement. But she thinks the reason the party matters is because it is simply life. Having people over, having a party, that is life. She says, that's what I do it for. It's for life. It's because it's life. This could also be a quiz question. Since she's lying on the sofa trying to rest, she's thinking about all these things, how Peter had said, but your parties, what's the sense of all your parties? He couldn't really understand. And she said to him that they're an offering, which sounded horribly vague, but who was Peter to make out that life was all plain sailing? Peter always in love with the wrong woman. What's your love? She might say to him, chasing some women. She thinks that his pursuits of happiness are probably not as important as her or not as meaningful. She knew his answers, how it is the most important thing in the world and no woman possibly understood it very well. So she imagines the two of them, talking about and judging her party. And then she tries to go a little bit deeper. She tries to think, like, what is it about the parties? These judgments. She first decides that these men and their judgments are superficial. In her own mind now, she thinks to herself, what does it mean to her, this thing she calls life? It was very strange, very queer. Here was so-and-so in South Kensington, someone up in Bayswater, somebody else in Mayfair. These are all little communities in London, boroughs they call them. And she felt quite continuously a sense of their existence. And she felt what a waste. And she felt what a pity. And she felt if only they could be brought together. And so she did. Okay, so here's her justification. She's having parties because she knows people all scattered around the city, and she thinks it's sad that they're alone and that they should all come together. That is definitely one reason to have a party, is to build community. It was an offering to combine, to create. But to whom? Great question. Who's it an offering for? Is it really for them, or is it for her? I think that's the obvious question here. An offering for the sake of an offering, perhaps? She's not going to admit it's for herself. Anyhow, it was her gift. Nothing else had she of the slightest importance. Okay, so now we're getting a little deeper. She feels like this is all she can do. She doesn't think, she says. She can't think, she can't write, she can't play the piano. She muddles the Armenians and the Turks. She loves success. She hates discomfort. She must be liked. She talks oceans of nonsense. And to this day, ask her what the equator is, and she doesn't know. So she admits to herself that she's ignorant. And so this is the only way she can find meaning, is to have parties and have people over. All the same, that one day should follow another, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, that one should wake up in the morning, see the sky, walk in the park, meet Hugh Whitbread. Then suddenly in comes Peter, and then the roses. It was enough. So all these things that she's done so far today, walk through the park, go get the flowers, bump into people she knows. This is life, and this makes her happy. Maybe she's trying to convince herself. After that, how unbelievable death was. So part of this is trying to just avoid thoughts of death, that it must end, and no one in the whole world would know how she had loved it all, how every instant. So I made a note here. This is a lot to unpack regarding a party. She's afraid of death. She wants to matter. She wants to belong. She wants to be important and be respected. All these things are tied up into this party. So now you can maybe see why she's freaking out about who shows up there, because it might in some way change her own experience of it. And then it goes to talk about who the Dalloways are. But first, what we have is Elizabeth coming in. The door opens. Elizabeth knew that her mother was resting, and she comes in very quietly. She stood perfectly still. Was it that some Mongol had been wrecked on the coast of Norfolk, as Mrs. Hilbery said, had mixed with the Dalloway ladies perhaps 100 years ago? Okay, so what is this all about? Well, the Dalloways in general were fair-haired, blue-eyed. Elizabeth, on the contrary, was dark. This is interesting. So she doesn't look like her parents in terms of their complexion. She had Chinese eyes and a pale face. Now, I know we haven't read together To the Lighthouse, but this reference to Chinese eyes comes up again in Virginia Woolf's writing. Does it literally mean Chinese eyes or very small eyes? But she has features that do not look like her parents. She's kind of like exotic looking. She was gentle, considerate, and still. As a child, she had had a perfect sense of humor, but now at 17, so now we know exactly how old Elizabeth is, Clarissa could not in the least understand how she had become very serious, like a hyacinth, sheathed in glossy green, with buds just tinted, a hyacinth which had no sun, another simile for describing her daughter, who, as she ages, is just getting so serious. That's why she's, spending all this time with this Doris Kilman, who's praying with her and having deep philosophical discussions. She stood quite still and looked at her mother, but the door was ajar, and outside the door was Miss Kilman, and Clarissa knew it. Miss Kilman in her mackintosh, listening to whatever they said. So this is another pause, because we're going to shift into more background on Miss Kilman. So right away we know that Clarissa cannot talk openly to Elizabeth because she knows Miss Kilman is out in the hall eavesdropping.